welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. This is our mini episode where I will hone in on some of the finer points from last week's main episode. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today I'll be continuing our discussion on the 1953 film Stalag 17. The film focuses on the daily life and routine of American Army Air Force's enlisted prisoners of war in a German prison camp in Austria in 1944. The movie follows one J.J. Sefton, a sort of camp pariah that is assumed to be a German stool pigeon, while Sefton also runs the majority of the camp's black market trade and entertainment venues. Stalag 17 stars William Holden as J.J. Sefton, Don Taylor as Lieutenant Dunbar, Otto Preminger as Colonel von Scherbach, Peter Graves, Edmund Trzynski, and many others. The film was directed by the great Billy Wilder, produced by Billy Wilder, written by Edwin Bloom and Billy Wilder, based on the play of the same name written by Edmund Trzynski and Donald Bevan. Stalag 17 was a huge commercial and critical success. As was noted in the main episode, Stalag 17 was written by Donald Bevan and Edmund Trzynski. Now, I talked about Bevan and Trzynski at some length in the main episode, and there is no need to go back into their stories again. But I just wanted to reiterate how important it was that these two guys, specifically these two guys, wrote the play that was eventually turned into the movie we discussed. As I initially said, the fact that real POWs wrote the story is obvious in the details that are seen throughout the film. And while the small details like the bunny slippers, sorted pieces of flight gear, lack of real food, etc. are accurate, they do differ somewhat from the real Stalag 17B in Austria. I'll lay out some of those differences now. The real Stalag 17, or as I said, Stalag 17B, as it was actually called, was near the Austrian town of Krems. Stalag 17B had been a prison for quite a while before it started receiving its first American airmen in 1943. Founded in 1938, it served as a concentration camp, not a concentration camp like one thinks about when one talks about the Holocaust, but an actual prison. The prison was used to house political prisoners and criminals, like most German prisons. It didn't house any Jews or anything like that. In 1939 and 1940, Stalag 17B was first used to house prisoners of war. The first Allied POWs arrived or housed in Krems were Poles and men captured during the Germans' campaign through Western Europe in 1940. Now, the numbers of prisoners were relatively low, but POWs from other Allied nations caught in the way of the German steamroller began to arrive in camp shortly after. Men from Yugoslavia, Italy, France, and the Soviet Union arrived too. On October 13, 1943, the first American prisoners of war arrived in Stalag 17B, and they came from Stalag 7A. By January 1944, which is roughly when this movie takes place, there were over 2,000 American prisoners of war in 17B. By war's end, over 4,200 Americans would be in Stalag 17B, while the entire camp housed over 29,000 prisoners of war from various nations. The Americans occupied 5 compounds, each of which measured 175 yards by 75 yards and contained 4 double barracks, 100 by 240 feet. The barracks were built to accommodate 240 men, but at least 4,000 men were crowded into them after the first 3 months of occupancy. Each double barracks contained a washroom of 6 basins in the center of the building. The beds in the barracks were triple-decked, and each tier had 4 compartments with 1 manual compartment, making a total of 12 men in each group. Each single barrack had a stove to supply heat and cooking facilities for approximately 200 men. The fuel ration for the week was 54 pounds of coal. Because of the lack of heating and an insufficient number of blankets, the men slept 2 to a bunk for added warmth. Getting nice and cozy in the POW barracks there, which of course helped to spread diseases that soon became rampant within the camp. Aside from the 9 double barracks used for housing purposes, 1 barrack was reserved for the infirmary and the medical personnel's quarters. 1 was a barracks library, and another half was for the American non-com in charge. Now, these were all sergeants and non-commissioned officers. There weren't, unlike the movie where it shows, a couple of officers here and there, specifically Lieutenant Dunbar, that wasn't the case in 17B. The Germans kept officers and enlisted men strictly separate from one another. There was a theater, part of which was used for food distribution and part for Red Cross food distribution and a meeting room. Now, the Red Cross packages is something that we talked about in the main episode. They were few and far between. They did get them, but not very often. There was 1 barracks building that was used as a sort of a tailor and cobbler shop for the prisoners' shoes and clothing items, which quickly began to wear out and become useless. The things that did hold up better than most were the leather jackets, and you see that in the movie. See it quite well, actually. As the population of the camp grew, thanks in part to the Germans shooting down Allied aircraft in droves in 1944, additional barracks were added. 2 buildings were closed down and torn down because a German CO, Oberst Kuhn, who I'll talk about in a minute, felt that they were too close to the fence and could be used as staging areas for escape attempts, which they were. The entire camp was ringed with electrically charged barbed wire and guarded by watchtowers at strategic points along the wire, manned by German guards, usually older guards or seriously injured guys who were incapacitated in one way or another during the war and who were no longer considered frontline troops or fit for actual combat action. And this was not just at Stalag 17B. This was at most POW camps. You didn't see too many strapping young, guards manning POW or guarding POW camps in Germany. The Great Escape shows a lot of actually all of the guards to be, these incredibly physically fit, Aryan god-looking guys, and that's just not the case. Now, the German CO, Oberst Kuhn, Colonel Kuhn, was not a well-liked man at all, certainly not by the prisoners and not by his staff either. It seemed that Kuhn strongly resented being placed in charge of an Allied prisoner of war camp. He felt he was destined for greater things, and as a result of that feeling, he did not make any attempts to win friends and influence people, shall we say. The colonel in the movie is thought to be a fair representation of the actual colonel, although most former POWs say that the real Oberst Kuhn was much worse than the one portrayed in the film. Now, what made Kuhn so disliked? Well, for one, he was unreasonable and unresponsive. The American non-commissioned officer in charge of Stalag 17B was granted an audience with Kuhn to discuss prisoner issues, but it took Kuhn 4 months to allow him to speak with him. At that time, the American, Staff Sergeant Kenneth Kurtenbach, registered complaints of lack of food, lack of medicine, unsanitary conditions, and other concerns. Kurtenbach was told to put his complaints in writing, which he did, and send them in, which he also did. Weeks passed before Kuhn acknowledged receipt of the complaints, by which time Kurtenbach's list had only grown and the situation had become only worse. Kurtenbach complained repeatedly, only to be ignored constantly, like talking to a wall. A big thing we see in the film is the recreation by the prisoners, mainly to keep themselves mentally sharp and try and avoid the constant boredom of prisoner of war life. In the real Stalag 17B, recreation was also done for the same reasons. Now, whether mouse races run by one entrepreneurial fellow actually happen, who knows? You'd like to think it would, but it's fun to think about anyway. What did happen in the camp was a highly organized operation of entertainment and education. All camp recreation was handled by a tech sergeant named Alexander Haddon, although Haddon was no J.J. Sefton, mouse races aside. Now, the POWs depended a great deal on card games, checkers, chess, and other indoor games, as well as reading material from the well-stocked library. A complete public address system with speakers in each barrack inspired the organization of a radio station, which furnished scheduled programs of music and information. The most outstanding effort in the field of recreation was the educational program, organized by Haddon, as I said, with the following aims and objectives. 1, to keep men mentally alert. 2, to offer accredited instruction, believe it or not. 3, to help men plan for post-war educational and vocational activities. And that is really, really, really cool if you really think about it. Sergeant Haddon was assisted by a staff composed of instructors, librarians, a secretary, and office help. Classes in mathematics, laws, photography, music, economics, American history, shorthand, auto mechanics, English, Spanish, German, and French were given to the students. School was held in a building containing the fiction and technical libraries. 6 separate classrooms accommodating 40 men were used for instruction, and furniture consisted of benches, tables, and blackboards. Because the limited supply of technical books prevented a checkout system, tables and benches were furnished only for reference work. Interests, which were not handled in the scheduled classes named above, were provided for in evening discussion groups. These were usually journalism, farm management, and livestock farming, and were directed by men who had successful experience in those fields back home. These evening discussion groups were particularly popular during the spring and summer months when they could be held outdoors after the supper hour. In 1945, Stalag 17B was evacuated of the majority of its prisoners. With the Soviets closing in from the east, the Germans felt that the evacuation of the camp was necessary. On April 8, 1945, over 4,000 of the POWs began an 18-day march to Braunau in Austria, nearly 280 miles away. Nearly 900 POWs were left behind at the camp. These men were too sick to make the march and were liberated by the Soviets in May of 1945. The marching column was divided into 8 groups of 500, with an American leader in charge of each group, guarded by about 20 German Volkssturm guards and 2 dogs. At the end of the day, they were forced to bivouac in open fields, regardless of the weather. On 3 occasions, the men were quartered in cow barns. The only food furnished to POWs by the German authorities was a barley soup and bread. Trading with the German and Austrian civilians became the main source of sustenance. You got to remember, too, this is at the end of the war, or very nearly the end of the war. A lot of the German and Austrian civilians realized who was losing and who was winning, despite the fact that the Germans held a lot of POWs. They knew, let's just say, where their bread was going to be buttered in the few months coming up. After the POWs arrived in Braunau, they constructed wooden huts to get out of the elements and awaited liberation. That liberation came on May 3rd, 1945, when men of the 13th Armored Division arrived at the new camp, disarmed the few German guards that were still there, and began to care for and feed the former POWs. By the 9th of May, most of the former POWs had been flown out of the area by C-47 to France, where they received full rehabilitation before being sent back home to the United States. American prisoners of war in Europe certainly did not live a life of luxury. Deprivations of necessary things like proper food and medicine, shelter sometimes, and other basics were often a distant memory. Disease became rampant with the lack of medicine, improper nutrition, poor sanitary conditions, and close confines, and treatment at the hands of the German guards could indeed be rough. But when one compares the life of a European theater POW to the life of an unfortunate soul who was captured by the Japanese, the picture gets brighter pretty quickly. Now, before I go, I just wanted to say that we will be on an unanticipated hiatus due to the coronavirus, COVID-19. We here at the podcast and the National World War II Museum need to stay safe and healthy, and we hope you will understand. Until then, make sure and go back and listen to the episodes you may have missed. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on Stitcher and iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer Mallory Kirk and our sound engineer Jeremy Burson. Stay safe and stay healthy. See you soon. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.